Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dear Katie, where survivors of sexual assault, rape, and abuse share their stories from hurt to healing. I'm your host, Katie Kestner. When I was age 18, I appeared on the cover of Time magazine to speak out nationally and really internationally as a victim of acquaintance rape. And since then, I've dedicated my entire life, my career, all of my energy to helping survivors and really raising awareness around sexual assault, ultimately to end sexual violence in all forms. In this episode of Dear Katie, I am joined by Claire Kaplan, and we are lucky enough to have an expert episode with Aishah Shahidah Simmons. If you've been lucky enough to see the groundbreaking film No, the Rape documentary, or read the book Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, then you know the world-class changemaker Aishah Shahidah Simmons. She is a path-breaking cultural worker, inviting diasporic Black people to join her in transformative storytelling to envision a world which ends child sexual abuse without relying on the criminal justice system. You will hear our discussion is so rich that we couldn't even finish. So perhaps think of this as part one of an amazing conversation. And if you want part two, just let us know. Welcome to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Kestner.
And this is Claire Kaplan. And before we get started, I want to remind our listeners we engage in conversations about topics that can be difficult to hear and triggering for some. So again, just think about reaching out to someone if you need it or a resource if you need to. And at the end of the podcast, we'll give you the address of our website that will give you resources.
Thanks so much, Claire. And today we are so excited and thrilled to have with us Aishah Shahidah Simmons. Aishah, you have done so much with your all different spaces and places, your voice and your powerful vision for kind of a new way to think about so many important topics to our themes of sexual violence prevention and survivor support. So if you don't mind, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your own background in your own words.
Sure. Well, first, let me just say thank you, Katie and Claire, for inviting me to be a guest on this podcast. It is really a gift to be able to talk about these issues, which are so near and dear to me personally and creatively and politically. I am a survivor of childhood sexual violence and adult sexual violence. I have been working in the fields of disrupting, ending, and healing from forms of sexual violence since 1994, when I started working on my film, No, the Rape documentary, which was released in 2006. And so there was No. And then many years later, I edited an anthology titled Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Childhood Sexual Abuse. That came out in 2019. It received and won the 2020 Lambda Literary Award. No is Ford Foundation funded, and it received a lot of awards for Best Documentary at the Indian Women's International Film Festival, the San Diego Women's International Film Festival. I'm presently a Soros Media Fellow, completing my trilogy of cultural work that uses sexual storytelling as a praxis to heal from, disrupt, and end sexual violence without relying on the carceral state. So this project, the first two projects, really is I was collecting and documenting the stories of approximately somewhere between 70 and 80 diasporic Black survivors of childhood sexual abuse and adult sexual violence. And then this project, I'm going to go in and really talk about my story and journey, also as a roadmap. So that's a lot of my work. I think I want to say that I would not be here were it not for many, 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 many years of therapy, beginning in 1992. So continuously, I've been engaged in therapy and believe in therapy. And then also for me, my contemplative practice, spiritual practice of Buddhist meditation, that has all those two, as well as working in communities who are working to end sexual violence. Those are my grounding anchors to doing this work.
Oh my goodness, that is amazing journey. And I know Claire and I have tons of questions, and I'm thinking about our listeners, and already you've given us so much to think about and consider, and and your journey alone and your perseverance and your leaning in on therapy and your Buddhist meditation and practice, I think is really important to think about sustainability for our survivors. My first thought is in 1994, I know the year well. I was just finishing college finally and had, shared my own story nationally and publicly in 1990, 91. So I think about where you were in 94 historically and where I was, and it was a very white, closed-minded world. So could you maybe start our listeners out with what does it mean to struggle and fight for so many years, and how did you even start that process?
Yeah. It was a really hard, it was a difficult time. And I think it's really important in terms of thinking about context. So first of all, I feel like my work would not exist without the work of so many before me, thinking about, for instance, and a lot of people don't necessarily know this, of civil rights activists such as Rosa Parks, that the framework for the famous Montgomery bus boycott, what's the foundation of that was anti-rape work that Rosa Parks was doing in response to sexual violence that was happening in apartheid the South in the U.S. And then and so many others, the Combahee River Collective, Loretta Ross at the DC Rape Crisis Center, and Kenji Ture at the DC Rape Crisis Center. And I just share that because I think so often in this contemporary moment, we see stories or we see movements, and we don't understand that all the seismic, and there's still a lot of more change that needs to happen, that has happened is a result of all these seeds being planted along the way. So when I started making No in 1994, I was 25. I was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, but I wasn't even dealing with that at all. I was raped my sophomore year in college. I dropped out of school after my assault, and I became pregnant, and I was able to have a safe and legal abortion. So it was a very traumatic time period for me. And when I started, and that was 89. So 5 years later, and 2 years after doing therapy, beginning my therapy journey, I started working on No. And I didn't think it had anything to do with me at all. Like for me, I was like making this film to break silences in Black communities around sexual violence, just following up from what you were saying, Katie, precisely because it was such a white dominated conversation around sexual violence. And then the history of lynching of Black men for being accused of raping white women, that it created a loud silence in Black communities around talking about sexual violence. And I, see this in terms of the work of like Alice Walker in The Color Purple, or Ntozake Shange in her famous play for colored girls. So for me, I saw this kind of insular work, like we have to break this silence, because if racism ended right now, or right now being in 94, let alone 2021, we're still not safe from sexual violence. So it was really hard. I'm out lesbian. I didn't get funding right away. I mean, it was a serious uphill battle. And I want to say though, the flip side of that is just the power of community, the power of the anti-violence movement, specifically women of color who really played pivotal roles in helping this film get made. The Estrella Foundation, Lesbian Foundation for Justice, was the first institutional funder to give money towards the making of No. I would screen works in progress of the film across this country at colleges and universities, and then also internationally. That there was a big international movement in France, in England, the Netherlands, where and this was multiracial, where folks were helping organizing screenings and fundraising screenings to talk about the issue of sexual violence and using those screenings as fundraising opportunities that then I would put back into the film.
I know Claire's going to have a question, but Aishah, I want to go back to one more point because our listeners, we are older women, and I also want to just go back to one more starting point for your journey and fight. And that while you talked about Rosa Parks and all these other who have come before us, one of the most fabulous books I read in my feminist theory class was This Bridge Called My Back.
Yes.
It was so powerful and so eye-opening for me, but all we had back then were books.
Right.
Like we could there was a TV. There was a TV, but in order to we were pounding literally the pavement. We didn't have social media. We had the wires of the press. If the gods of the press thought you were worthy of picking up a story, but things are so different. And I think that starting point for how steep your climb was, Aishah, to me, a lot of people don't realize that. Because the accessibility of leadership, voices, women's voices, women of color, women non-heterosexual, like those were, like diamonds. We had diamonds every so often, hard to find. And so a lot of what I hear you saying is you had to envision something alone.
No, thank you. And because one of the things that I always tell people is like, I was making a film. There was no Kickstarter, no Indiegogo, no GoFundMe.
That's right.
None of that.
Right.
There was no social media. It was like mailing postcards, going to conferences, handing out brochures. It was foot to pavement.
I so remember when Aishah, when you were raising money for this film, because periodically I would receive appeals, and I don't even know what format they were in, but people would talk about it. People would send notes out. You were probably writing postcards like crazy, whatever it was. And I just remember it took years for you to get all the funding together for that.
Yeah, it was 12 years, 12 years, 7 of which were full time and many single digit checking account days and all of that. And for me, it was very much, it was a serious Black feminist led project. So my whole crew, in terms of the production crew, were all Black women, and the editor is a white woman, and the composer is a Haitian American man. But it was very much, for me, I wanted the front to match the back, and I really believed in paying everyone their rates. So that was the other thing that made it very kind of radical, that I didn't ask folks to donate labor. That was really important to me. So that's why it took so long.
I'm glad you shared that, Aishah. That part of the uphill battle is such an inspiration because you persevered for years and years and years. So thank you for not giving up and all that you just said.
And that the film is so profound. I mean, I still remember parts of it, and I saw it years and years ago, particularly Marlon Riggs. I mean, that piece is just, amazing. But when the film was completed, what did that feel like?
Well, it took so long to make the film. It took 12 years, 7 of which were full time. And I think I had, I know I expected No to be well received. And when I say well received, it was well received, but I mean well received in terms of mainstream. And doors were closed. It didn't have the big premiere, quote unquote, festival premiere. Like, there were many festivals that I wanted it to premiere at. There were, in terms of broadcast entities, no one wanted to touch it. And I think it's because the film centers Black women survivors, and it not only centers it. So I show their victimization, but then I also show their agency, their healing process. I look at the film from enslavement through present day. Present day at that time was the early 2000s, really, and it's really a celebration of resilience and a call for accountability. And I think that at the time that it came out, it was not it was not where we are now. Like when we think about like incredible series such as Surviving R. Kelly, like that, that's not where we were in 2006. Now, with that shared, I am grateful and elated that the film had its world premiere at the Los Angeles Pan-African Film Festival, which in hindsight, right, I think it was a perfect place because it was like this film is a call to action in Black communities around like, how do we address this in the, within the height of white supremacist violence, that we cannot pick and choose. We have to do both and. So, and then it was, and also had great international reception because of a lot of the grassroots work that I had done raising the film, that there was already built-in audiences and colleges and universities were using it. And here we are in 2021, and it is still being used. It's still being taught.
It's still relevant.
It's still relevant, which is, on the one hand, it's very tragic that it's still relevant in the context of, disrupting rape culture. And it's also very powerful in the context of this body of work still being used as a resource, not only here, but also globally.
But let's talk about disrupting the rape culture, Aishah, because, every activist I meet has a different strategy, right?
I believe in the power of storytelling. Like, I think that storytelling is very powerful. Because it gives agency to those who've been impacted by the violence. And so I feel like the storytelling is what breaks, it plays a powerful role in breaking the silence. It plays a powerful role in affirming survivors' realities. And so that for me is, I'm a storyteller. I believe in telling stories, and I believe, and I know that stories transform the world. And we see, that's why I started as a filmmaker, and I'm a writer, in terms of the power of storytelling. Because when people have a connection, that I believe it is through that connection that people are moved. I also am strong, and I've been since for a very long time, which is evidenced in my film No and in my anthology. Really, how do we disrupt and end these inhumane forms of violence? How do we do it humanely? How do we center the most immediate survivors, make sure that they are safe, that we are safe, speaking as a survivor, but without throwing away the harm doers? And I want to be clear that doesn't mean not holding them accountable. But what we know is that most people who commit sexual harm are not held accountable in terms of a criminal justice system. We also know that prison doesn't stop rape, and that rape happens in prison, not only at the hands of other inmates, but at correctional officers, at correctional personnel. And so my desires, my interest is, what is it going to take to co-create a world without violence? What is that work that we are able to do in terms of tackling this pandemic? And I don't think that we will be able to do it if we only focus on like, oh, we'll just lock them up and throw away the keys. It's impossible. It's impossible.
And I would love to focus on that a little bit, because the anti-violence movement in general is clearly moving in that direction, to talk about the failure of the criminal justice system, not only to stop the violence, but also to address the problem at its root, and that, are we throwing away people who shouldn't be thrown away? And is there another approach, especially since the burden of incarceration has largely fallen on minoritized communities, and particularly Black and brown men. And how can we end one oppression by creating another oppression, basically? So that it's fascinating to me, and I love hearing the ideas that people have, and the conversation about trying to find new ways to address this. I'm curious if you could talk about, in the book, Love with Accountability, what sorts of ideas emerged from that?
Yeah. So Love with Accountability is an anthology of writings by 40 diasporic Black survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and some advocates, and one bystander who was my mother. They are they're African American, African Caribbean, Latinx, Indigenous, and from the continent of Africa. And what I did was I invited these contributors to each write and invited them to share their testimonies if they felt moved, but also to write about, to envision a world without violence. So how can we disrupt it? So I didn't want to just end on the trauma, but just in terms of how do we disrupt it? And the responses are quite incredible. And there's a lot of trauma in the book in terms of the stories, the power, the courage of these contributors, because everybody's using their names. There's no pseudonyms, and they're sharing their stories. And some folks are really they talk about the questions that we need to ask harm doers. Not why did you rape, but what would have prevented you from raping, for instance. What does it mean to, if you are a lifeguard in a at a pool swimming, you teach people how to swim. You don't teach them like don't drown. You prepare them. This is something that Ignacia Hutia Rivera, Shaiti Rivera writes about in their contribution. And so that, and their perspective is that in order to do rape prevention, in order to do prevents child sexual abuse, is that we have to do comprehensive sex education from the cradle to the grave. Loretta Ross really talks about, the work of how, confronting loved ones in our families. My mom talks about, and she's a survivor who's featured in my film No, and she did not protect me as a child. And she talks about, she writes about not protecting me. And I think that so often that this is what many of us survivors, not necessarily that they want their parents or caretakers to write about not protecting them, but to own up to it, to take accountability, be responsible for the harm that they cause. That so I think that for me, the whole the chorus of voices is really they invite us to think outside of the box. And some, let me be very clear, that there's some contributors who are like, we need to think outside of the box, and while we do that, we also need to use what systems we have. So, and that was important to me. I identify as somebody who continuously strives to embody abolitionist principles. It's a lot easier said than done, but it is my constant commitment. And simultaneously, I'm interested in having conversations, or creating a space where we have conversations with people who think very differently, because it's not just about speaking only to the choir. It's really about speaking for all of us to come across our differences, yet knowing that most of us share a goal of ending the violence. And so what is it going to take? And in order to do that, we have to be willing to have these difficult conversations.
I would tell my story, and I would know I was sitting in the fire with the lions at my feet, and they would throw all of their hate and anger and blame right at me every night. What I like about what you just said is you're saying something similar, which is as weak and vulnerable as we often feel as survivors, there's something powerful about being able to take it and listen to the anger and not let it eat us up. And I don't know if that's, what you think, but I'm fearful that if we don't find the fire, we're not going to make the change we want.
I completely agree. And it's not easy. And I actually want to back up a little bit. And because I said, because when you're talking about how, the hate or the vitriol and the judgment that can come out when we're talking about the harm that we've experienced, or even like talking with people who've been harmed, to just be like, yeah, I don't believe in prison as the answer. And yet, let me be very clear. This is how I feel, and along with many others. And I also understand that there are many survivors who don't. And so I walk gingerly. Like my goal is never to tell someone what to do, how, in terms of how they should respond to the violence. I think the problem is that for so many of us, we don't have other options. So of course, the thing is, you call the police and hopefully they get locked up. And I mean, that's the goal, right? That's what we're taught. But when a lot of times people really want accountability, they want insurance that this person will not do it again. And the image that is presented is prisons. And I think that there are other ways that there are other ways that can happen in terms of working towards preventing folks from committing harm again. And equally as important, which is why I brought up my mother as a bystander, is that we can't just focus on the person who commits the harm. There's so many people who allow it to happen, which is something that I think about in terms of these high profile cases like R. Kelly or Harvey Weinstein. Or when I was making No, I was in the height of the O.J. Simpson trial, of Mike Tyson, and the Clarence Thomas hearings. Like, all of this is kind of backdrop in many ways. And there's so many folks who allow this stuff to happen that we can kind of hone in on the one person. But if we don't deal with the kind of the systems in place that allow the harm to continue, we won't get to the root of it. So in response to what you're saying, Katie, I do think that it is critical to sit in the fire. And it's hard, and a lot of times it doesn't feel fair. I know for me, for the longest, I used to just say I was raped in my sophomore year in college, and I got pregnant and from the rape, and had a safe and legal abortion. That used to be the narrative. And the truth of the matter is that I was raped, and then the following night I had consensual sex with another person, another man. And so I don't know in terms of the pregnancy, right? But I used to be afraid to talk about it for that judgment, like people would blame me, right? And those are those difficult conversations that I understand that many cannot have. I can, and I feel a responsibility to put it out there, to deal with perhaps the onslaught of calling me, derogatory terms or critiquing my judgment and all of that. And my responses are always like, yeah, it was poor judgment. But is that the penalty? Is that what we're saying, that the penalty for poor judgment is sexual violence?
Right. And that's was my mantra when I worked in higher education is, well, she got drunk, or she did this thing, or she was partying, or whatever. I said, yeah, but should rape be the punishment for getting drunk? Or should rape be the punishment for having poor judgment, which is exactly the phrase. And so thank you for saying that. It's almost like it's a punishment, a form of punishment for women who stray outside the expected lines of behavior, right? But we know, of course, that many women are not straying and they still get raped. And also that somehow the burden of responsibility lands on the wrong person. And I think, when you're talking about there are people who still believe in the criminal justice system for punishing rapists or punishing child abusers. Yes, but I think it's also for some, it's more an issue of, I won't feel safe unless that person's locked up, right? So there's that personal issue of not just, I don't want them doing it to other people or other children, but I want to feel safe too. And there's that illusion. And yeah, there's a real piece of that safety, but at the same time, it's also an illusion. And how do we, for survivors who are already feeling vulnerable, and to think that it's an illusion is really a hard thing to hear.
Yeah, and I think that's the carceral response, because we want to feel safe. We want, I think, and so there's this illusion of okay, if they're just in jail, we're going to be okay, you know? And I think that so often, particularly when we're talking about childhood sexual abuse, um, it gets very complex and complicated in terms of family. Like for me, it was my grandfather. I didn't want him going to jail, or that wasn't even an option. But it's like, and then I also think and then in communities of color, that also plays a role, right? Because in particularly if we think about, I mean, every time we look up, we're hearing some report around violence committed, state sanctioned violence committed against our community. So then you're not going to call the police. So, but yet we have to hold people accountable in our communities. We have to, and not condone and not excuse. And this is the hard work.
How did you find reconciliation? And if so, it sounds like there's some. And how did you get there? And, especially with your mom.
My parents are human rights activists. They met in the civil rights movement, and have been engaged. They're still alive in global human rights work for. They're in their 70s, so I'm 52, so over 50 years. In terms of my father doing work on trafficking, my mother doing work on women's rights under Islamic law, and in terms of racial justice in this country, and then globally, my living abroad. My father, up until COVID, was living in Budapest, Hungary. So I share that. And I think it's really important because there's so often we hear these narratives or myths around like, oh, well, my parents didn't know, or they weren't exposed to things. My parents did know. My mother's a survivor and actually instituted a sexual harassment policy in 1964 during the Mississippi Freedom Summer. So, and yet she didn't protect me. I didn't realize all of this. I mean, I was more focused on the harm that my grandfather caused, my paternal grandfather. And I said that she didn't protect me. My father also didn't protect me. My parents are divorced. And so it wasn't until 2015, when I was 46, and we talked about No coming out in 2006. And I think that's so important to just name, because I think so often as activists, as, folks who are public survivors, that just to say that this is an ongoing journey. Like, I don't just arrive. I'm constantly evolving. And so I wasn't able to even begin to do the excavation around my childhood sexual abuse. And I really I understood my parents' bystanding roles because I told my parents what happened. And they initially didn't want to deal with it at all. Like and I thought I was going to lose it literally, because I couldn't believe that they weren't dealing with it. And I, thank goodness for therapy and my contemplative practice. And the words that just literally emerged were love with accountability, because I realized that, this kind of notion of, oh, my parents love me. Yes, I believe that. I know that. But I could not just accept that without accountability. So that came out of my meditative practice. And that's what I started demanding from both of them. And it took a while for us to get there. My mother first, and when she knew I was first doing the Love with Accountability Forum on the feministwire.com, an online publication, and that then transformed to the anthology, she asked if she could participate in the anthology to write about not protecting me, and particularly from the perspective of not clearly as my mother, but as a civil rights and women's rights and human rights activist. And so I think that I feel really fortunate, because I know for many people will never, ever get that in their lifetime. And which is why I always say that our healing cannot be contingent upon someone else getting it. Yes, I feel really fortunate, and we're still struggling. It's not an easy thing. There's, I mean, like I said, 2015, I was 46. My abuse happened when I was 10, from 10 to 12. So it's a long time. But I am grateful that my mother has not only taken the work to do the work with me behind the scenes, but also to publicly talk about it. And my father he's not talked about it publicly, but we've also done work around the healing. And I think what's I think powerful for in terms of the anthology, Love with Accountability, the anthology is to have not only my mother's writings, but the writings of of survivors talking about, I mean, all harm is invasion. Sexual harm is invasion and violation. And then there's a whole nother level that happens when you're a child, when it's someone that chances are you love, that that's trusted. And so for folks to really write about this, and across the gender spectrum, not just cisgender women and men, but also trans and gender non-binary people writing about it, and deaf contributors writing about the harm that we experience in our families and how we heal from it, and how do we address it? What is the work that we can do to end this? What does love with accountability look like?
Beautifully said, Aishah, beautifully said. And such a call. And I honor that you have, found a way to keep going with the healing process with your mom and dad. The only other question I have for you, Aishah, is what's next? I mean, you're only 52.
That was this is my question as well.
Only 52.
What's happening now, and what are you working on now?
Yeah, well, I'm writing a book, tentatively titled Love and Justice. And it's really, it's looking at sexual violence, and accountability, in first person. So, as I said, the earlier two works is a collage of 80 voices, for the documentary No, as well as the anthology combined. And now this is, I'm going in, right? Like, I think that I'm finally at a place where I can do that work. So that's a big project that I'm working on. And I will also be launching next year a podcast, Love with Accountability, looking at these specific issues that I've been talking about, really giving voice to the contributors in the anthology, but beyond that, because I think that, love with accountability specifically as it relates to sexual violence, but I see it in so many other components that we need in this. We need love and we need accountability. I firmly believe that. But the big project is the book project, Love and Justice.
Well, I look forward to reading it, and all the best in that project, because I know how hard it is to write a book. And I want to thank you for joining us. This is an amazing conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. I concur. And Aishah, we support you, and I hope our listeners will, pick up a book, pick up another book, I saw we can even get the documentary for $1
Yes.
off your site. I was so, that's so accessible. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I did that because of COVID.
Everyone should see it.
It's $1 rental.
Well, this has been such a joy to have you, and so much you offer, and keep going. And I know it's going to be important for so many others to hear your voice in so many different places and spaces. So thank you for spending some time with us. So thank you again, Aishah, for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners?
Really just want to encourage all survivors to take care, to remember that healing is a journey and never a destination. And for all those who love and support survivors, to be present and be there for the survivors, and also be there for the harm doers. Hold them accountable. Hold them accountable with love, and hold them accountable. Let's not condone violence. Let's disrupt and end it.
Thanks, Aishah. So this has been a Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Kessner.
And this is Claire Kaplan. And as a reminder, if you visit takebackthe.night.org, you'll find access to resources if you need them, if you're a survivor or someone who loves a survivor.
And as we always do, we're going to close with our Shatter the Silence, and together we will end the violence. Please tune in to our next episode, and we look forward to having you all join us again.
So long, everyone.
We're grateful to all of you who have joined us for this episode of Dear Katie Survivor Stories. If you need support but don't know where to find it, please visit takebackthe.night.org for a list of resources. You can reach out to our legal support hotline, connect with other survivors through our social media, and you can also help other survivors simply by subscribing to our podcast and sharing it far and wide. Please consider posting it on your own social media with some remark about what it's done to help you, and make sure to follow us on ours. Dear Katie is completely produced by all of us, an amazing group of volunteers. We care so much about this cause. The paycheck isn't what we're doing it for. Thank you to all of our volunteers. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you for our survivors, wherever you are, for being present and joining us in this process of growth, strength, and healing. Always remember, self-care is essential to healing and to thriving.